Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going way back in time to explore a period that honestly uh, still shapes a nation even today. We're talking to the Nigerian Civil War.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, also known as the Biafran War.
Okay.
This conflict lasted from 1967 to 1970
Wow.
and was absolutely devastating. I mean, we're
Whoa.
talking over 1 million lives lost.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, and we're going to try to unpack all of this using an article by Gavin Williams, who is like a leading expert when it comes to African political economy.
Okay.
Heavy stuff, I know,
Yeah.
but so crucial for understanding Nigeria today, almost 60 years later.
It's really remarkable how something that happened so long ago
I know.
can still have such a hold on a country.
And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating.
Yeah.
We're not just looking at, dates and battles and things like that,
Mhm.
but we're trying to understand how this war continues to influence Nigeria's politics, society, even its economy.
It's like we're trying to understand a puzzle, but some of the pieces are still missing.
Oh, I like that.
We have to look closely at the pieces we do have
Right.
to try to see how they all fit together.
Okay, so let's start putting those pieces together.
Okay.
The article mentions this perceived marginalization of the Igbo people
Right.
and their grievances about representation and power. That was a key factor behind the Biafran secession.
Yeah.
But the article also cautions against oversimplification.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Like, it's tempting to just see it as like a simple Igbo plot or
Yes.
Northern conspiracy.
Yeah.
But the reality is so much more complex.
For sure.
Nigerian politics at the time was just this tangled web of alliances and rivalries
Yeah.
that shifted constantly.
Williams actually lays out this whole timeline of events that kind of build up to the war.
Wow.
And it starts with the amalgamation of the northern and southern protectorates,
Okay.
which, if I'm understanding this correctly,
Yeah.
this is basically what created Nigeria as we know it today.
Yes, but it wasn't exactly a smooth process.
Okay.
It brought together very different regions with very different cultures and political systems. And that in itself, kind of created these tensions
Right.
that simmered beneath the surface.
So then you have all these contentious elections throughout the 1950s and early 60s.
Yes.
The article specifically mentions the Action Group crisis of 1962.
Yeah.
Was that like a major turning point, do you think?
It was definitely a sign that things were becoming increasingly unstable.
Okay.
The Action Group was one of the major political parties at the time.
Right.
And its internal divisions reflected the broader fractures
Okay.
within Nigerian society.
And this was all before the war even started.
Yeah.
So it sounds like the situation was already pretty volatile.
Yeah, getting it.
Yeah.
Each event kind of builds on the last one,
Uh-huh.
ratcheting up the tension.
Okay.
Then in 1962 and 1963, you have these controversial census counts,
Right.
which really fueled anxieties about political representation
Okay.
and the balance of power between these different regions.
So everyone's already on edge.
Yeah.
And then you have these disputed census results,
Right.
which just add fuel to the fire.
Exactly. It fed into these existing suspicions that were already there
Right.
and made people question, the fairness of the entire system.
Oh, wow.
And of course, this played right into the lead up to the 1964 federal election.
Which, from what I'm reading, was basically a recipe for disaster.
It was highly contested
Yeah.
with accusations of rigging and widespread violence.
Oh, gosh.
And it didn't stop there. The following year, in 1965,
Yeah.
the Western regional elections were plagued by similar problems.
So 2 elections back to back, both marred by violence
Yeah.
and accusations of fraud.
Uh-huh.
It's like the country was coming apart at the seams.
And sadly, it was.
Wow.
These events, coupled with the existing tensions,
Right.
created this perfect storm that led to the coups of January and July 1966.
Wow, those coups must have been a major shock to the system.
They were.
Yeah.
The first coup in January 1966 was carried out by a group of mostly Igbo officers. They claimed to be targeting corrupt politicians,
Right.
but many saw it as an attempt to seize power for the Igbo people.
Okay, so that explains some of that, like, Igbo plot narrative
Right.
that Williams cautions against.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that the July 1966 counter-coup
Okay.
was led by a group of mostly northern officers,
Okay.
which further complicates the picture.
So it's not as simple as just one group versus another.
Not at all.
Okay.
And to make matters even worse, both coups were followed by these waves of horrific violence
Oh, no.
that targeted specific ethnic groups.
Gosh.
The killings in May, August, and September of 1966 left thousands dead
Wow.
and fueled a cycle of revenge and retribution.
It sounds absolutely terrifying. Like
That-
the country was descending into chaos.
Yeah.
And this is all before the war even officially begins.
The situation was incredibly complex
Yeah.
and volatile, and, amidst all of this turmoil,
Yeah.
there's another element that often gets overlooked.
Okay, what's that?
The role of the state, and specifically the control of resources,
Okay.
particularly oil.
Okay, let's talk about oil. I know it's obviously a major factor in Nigeria's economy,
Yeah.
but how did it play a role in this lead up to the war?
Well, oil represents wealth, power, and control.
Yeah.
And in Nigeria, the discovery of oil in the 1950s had created this huge economic potential.
Right.
But it also brought a lot of complications.
It's interesting because you often hear about oil being a curse
Right.
for these resource-rich countries.
Right.
It seems like that's what was happening here.
Yeah. In a way,
Lots like-
the oil wealth, while promising, also exacerbated existing tensions.
Uh-huh.
It became this prize that different groups within Nigeria were vying for,
Wow.
further deepening these divisions
Oh.
and fueling the conflict.
So instead of uniting the country, oil was actually driving it further apart.
It was a double-edged sword.
Okay.
On the one hand, it held the potential for incredible prosperity,
Right.
but on the other, it created this very dangerous scramble
Gotcha.
for power and control.
And that's where these super permsecs come in.
Ah, yes.
Williams mentions them in his article, but
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure who they are or what their role was.
So the term super permsex refers to these powerful bureaucrats
Okay.
who essentially controlled access to oil revenues.
Wow.
They were incredibly influential figures
Okay.
who often operated behind the scenes,
Uh-huh.
wielding enormous power within the government.
Okay, so they were like the gatekeepers of oil wealth.
Precisely.
Wow.
And their actions had a significant impact on the political landscape.
Okay.
They could influence policy decisions,
Uh-huh.
allocate resources,
Yeah.
even shape the direction of the country's development.
So how did they factor into these growing tensions that led to the war?
Well, their control over oil revenue meant that they could choose to favor certain regions
Right.
or groups over others.
Gotcha.
And this created a system where patronage and corruption thrived,
Oh, wow.
which further undermined trust in the government
Right.
and exacerbated existing grievances.
So it wasn't just about ethnic or religious differences.
Right.
It was also about access to power and resources.
Right.
With these super permsecs playing a key role in that dynamic.
You're getting it.
Okay, good.
And that's one of the things that makes this period so fascinating. You
Yeah.
have all of these different factors,
Right.
political ambitions,
Right.
ethnic tensions,
Yeah.
economic disparities,
Uh-huh.
and the scramble for oil wealth,
Okay.
all
Yeah.
colliding in a way that ultimately led to this devastating war.
This is already so much to unpack.
Yeah,
And we haven't even gotten to the war itself.
I know.
I'm starting to see why understanding this period is so important for understanding Nigeria today.
It's like the foundation upon which everything else is built.
Yeah.
And it's only by understanding this foundation
Uh-huh.
that we can truly grasp the complexities of contemporary Nigeria.
All right, so we've laid out the groundwork. Simmering tensions, controversial elections,
Yeah.
the rise of these super permsecs,
Mm-hmm.
and the allure, but also the dangers
Yeah.
of oil wealth.
Hmm.
What happens next?
Well, that's where things really start to heat up.
Okay.
We'll delve into the outbreak of the war itself
Oh,
and its devastating consequences
Okay.
in the next part of our deep dive.
wow. I can't wait to hear more. This is already so much more complex and fascinating than I ever imagined.
It is.
To be continued. All right, so we left off with Nigeria, like right on the brink of war.
Yeah.
It's 1966. The country's been rocked by twos and violence riscade.
Yeah.
Political tensions are sky high, and that promise of oil wealth has only added fuel to the fire. Where do we go from here?
Well, in May 1967, the eastern region, led by Lieutenant Colonel Odumegwu Ojukwu, declared its secession from Nigeria
Wow.
and proclaimed the Republic of Biafra.
Okay.
And this was like the spark that ignited the Civil War.
So after all the buildup we talked about, this is the moment everything explodes.
Right.
What were the immediate reactions to Biafra's declaration?
The Nigerian government, led by General Yakubu Gowon, refused to recognize Biafra's secession
Okay.
and vowed to maintain the unity of the country. Uh-huh.
What followed was a brutal conflict that lasted for almost 3 years.
The scale of this war is just staggering. Over 1 million people died, many from starvation and disease.
Right.
It's hard to even comprehend that level of human suffering.
It was a horrific tragedy.
Yeah.
The Biafran region was blockaded by the Nigerian government,
Oh, wow.
which led to widespread famine
Ah.
and a humanitarian crisis of just immense proportions.
Yeah.
Images of starving Biafran children
Right.
shocked the world and really drew international attention to the conflict.
And how did the war actually play out? Was it like a clear-cut victory for one side?
Well, the Nigerian federal forces gradually gained the upper hand,
Okay.
capturing major Biafran cities and towns.
Right.
But the Biafran forces, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, put up a fierce resistance.
Really?
Oh, yeah. They employed guerrilla tactics and even built their own weapons,
Wow.
including this locally produced armored car nicknamed the Red Devil. I had no idea they were that resourceful. It sounds like they were determined to fight for their survival.
They absolutely were. But in the end, the disparity in resources and manpower proved too great.
Yeah.
In January 1970, facing defeat and starvation, the Biafran leadership surrendered.
Wow.
And the war came to an end.
It's a bittersweet ending. The war is over, but it's such a tremendous cost. What happened in the immediate aftermath? How did Nigeria begin to rebuild?
Well, General Gowon declared a policy of no victor, no vanquished, aiming for reconciliation and reintegration.
Okay.
There was this massive humanitarian effort to provide relief to the war-torn Biafran region.
Right.
But the scars of the conflict ran deep.
For sure.
And the process of healing and rebuilding would prove to be long and complex.
It's like trying to mend a broken bone.
Yeah.
It takes time and care for it to heal properly. And even then, there might always be a faint scar.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And, the legacy of the Civil War extends far beyond the physical rebuilding. It's had a profound and lasting impact on Nigerian society and politics.
And that's what makes this deep dive so important.
Yeah.
We're not just looking at a historical event like in isolation.
Right.
We're trying to understand how it continues to shape Nigeria today.
Exactly. Think about it.
Yeah.
The war raised these fundamental questions about the nature of Nigerian federalism,
Okay.
the relationship between different ethnic groups,
Right.
and the distribution of power and resources.
Wow.
These are issues that continue to be debated and contested in Nigeria today.
It's like the war exposed all these fault lines that were already there. And they continue to shape the landscape decades later.
Precisely. And to understand these fault lines,
Yeah.
we need to look at the specific ways the war's legacy manifests itself in contemporary Nigeria.
Okay.
One of the most visible legacies is the continued dominance of the military
Oh, okay.
in Nigerian politics.
The article mentions generals' elections. Can you elaborate on that? It sounds like the military's influence didn't disappear with the end of the war.
It didn't at all.
Really?
In fact, Nigeria experienced a series of military coups
Wow.
in the decades following the Civil War.
Gosh.
Even when civilian rule was restored,
Okay.
the military remained a powerful force, often intervening in politics and influencing policy decisions.
So it wasn't just about overt military rule. It was about a deeper culture of militarization that permeated Nigerian society and politics.
Right. You had former generals becoming prominent politicians.
Wow.
And the military continued to hold significant economic and political power.
Gosh.
This had a lasting impact on the development of democratic institutions
Right.
and the rule of law in Nigeria.
It's like the war created a power structure that was really difficult to dismantle even after the fighting stopped.
And that power structure wasn't limited to the military.
Okay.
The Civil War also had a profound impact on interethnic relations. It brought to the fore the complexities of ethnic and religious identities in Nigeria, and in many ways reshaped the landscape of identity politics.
The article mentions the emergence of new political identities.
Right.
And claims for recognition. Can you give me some specific examples of that?
Well, the war highlighted the grievances of various minority groups
Okay.
who felt marginalized by the dominant ethnic groups.
All right.
This led to the emergence of new political movements and demands for greater autonomy or even secession.
So it wasn't just about the Igbo and their quest for Biafra.
Right.
It was about a broader reawakening of ethnic consciousness across Nigeria.
Exactly. The war, in a way, served as a catalyst for a more assertive articulation of ethnic identities and political demands. This has led to a constant renegotiation of power dynamics, often accompanied by tension and conflict. A dynamic process that continues to unfold even today.
It's a reminder that the quest for a truly unified and inclusive Nigeria is an ongoing process, one that has been deeply shaped by the legacy of the Civil War.
And another crucial aspect of that legacy is the issue of corruption.
Right.
The war, with its scramble for resources
Right.
and the concentration of power in the hands of a few, created a fertile ground for corruption to flourish.
How did that play out in the years following the war?
Well, oil wealth, which should have been a boon for Nigeria's development, often ended up lining the pockets of corrupt officials and their cronies.
Wow.
This created a system where patronage and cronyism thrived, undermining economic growth and exacerbating inequality.
So the war, in a way, intensified these existing patterns of corruption, making it even more difficult to address in the post-war period.
Unfortunately, yes, corruption became deeply entrenched in the political and economic systems, making it a persistent challenge for Nigeria ever since.
It's almost like this vicious cycle, war leads to corruption, which then undermines stability and development, which in turn can create conditions for further conflict.
That's a very insightful observation. It highlights the interconnected nature of these challenges and the long-lasting impact of conflict on a society's fabric.
It's a sobering thought. But it also underscores the importance of understanding these legacies if we want to, move forward. And speaking of moving forward, the article raises this crucial issue of memory and accountability.
You're right. How a society remembers its past, how it deals with the trauma of conflict, and how it seeks justice for past wrongs. These are all essential elements of building a more peaceful and just future.
But how do you even begin to address those things after such a devastating war? Where do you even start?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there are no easy answers. But Williams argues that the first step is to break the silence that has often surrounded the war.
What do you mean by breaking the silence? Is it about acknowledging what happened, talking about it more openly?
Exactly. It's about confronting the difficult truths of the past. Even if they're painful or uncomfortable. It's about giving voice to the victims, recognizing their suffering, and honoring their memory.
So it's not just about remembering the facts of the war. It's about understanding its human cost, its emotional impact on individuals and communities.
You're absolutely right. And it's also about acknowledging the wrongs that were committed. On all sides. And seeking accountability for those wrongs.
But how do you achieve accountability for atrocities that happened decades ago? Is that even possible?
It's a complex and sensitive issue, for sure. But Williams argues that it's an ethical obligation. It might involve truth and reconciliation commissions, public acknowledgments of wrongdoing, or even symbolic gestures of atonement. The process itself is as important as the outcome.
So it's not necessarily about punishment or retribution. But about acknowledging the past, learning from it, and trying to prevent similar tragedies from happening again.
That's the idea. It's about understanding how past grievances and injustices continue to shape the present. And using that understanding to build a more just and equitable future.
I'm struck by how relevant this all feels, even though we're talking about a war that ended over 50 years ago.
It speaks to the enduring power of history, doesn't it?
It really does.
The past isn't just something that happened long ago. It continues to shape our present and our future.
And it's a reminder that the challenges Nigeria faces aren't unique. Many nations around the world grapple with similar issues. Ethnic and religious tensions, economic disparities, political corruption, the struggle to build inclusive and equitable societies.
You're right. The Nigerian Civil War, though specific to its context, offers valuable lessons that transcend national borders. It's a story about the fragility of peace, the complexities of nation building, and the enduring quest for justice and reconciliation.
I'm so glad we're having this conversation. It's incredibly insightful and honestly a bit overwhelming. But in a good way.
I know what you mean. It's a lot to process, but I think that's a good thing. It means we're engaging with the material in a meaningful way.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the war itself, its devastating consequences, and its multifaceted legacy that continues to shape Nigeria today. What's next in our deep dive?
Let's delve into those takeaways and explore some final thought-provoking questions. In the last part of our deep dive, this will give our listeners something to chew on as they reflect on the complexities of the Nigerian Civil War and its enduring relevance.
Sounds good to me. To be continued.
Okay, so we've spent the last two parts of this deep dive really digging into the Nigerian Civil War, from its roots to its devastating consequences. And this long shadow it's cast on present-day Nigeria.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
Yeah, it really has. And honestly, we've only just scratched the surface of such a complex and multifaceted event. So as we wrap things up, what are like the key takeaways here? What should our listener be thinking about as they go about their day?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that the Nigerian Civil War wasn't just an isolated historical event.
Okay.
It was the culmination of decades of social, political, and economic tensions.
Right.
And its legacies continue to shape Nigeria even today.
So it's not just about understanding the past for the sake of history, but about recognizing how that past is still very much alive in the present.
Precisely. We've seen how the war, reshaped the country's political landscape, influenced ethnic relations, and exposed these deep-seated challenges.
Of corruption and inequality.
Right.
These are issues that Nigerians continue to grapple with today.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle, but some of the pieces are missing, and some of the pieces are from a different puzzle altogether.
That's a great way to put it.
I know, right?
And it makes finding solutions all the more challenging.
One of the things that really struck me was how the war exposed this fragility of peace.
Yeah.
And the complexities of nation building.
That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
Nigeria, with its diverse ethnic groups and competing interests, was already facing a difficult task in forging a cohesive national identity.
Right.
The war only amplified those challenges.
And it seems like the legacy of the war has in some ways made those challenges even harder to overcome.
In a way, yes.
Okay.
The deep wounds of the war, both physical and emotional, continue to affect communities and individuals.
I'm sure.
The mistrust and resentment that fueled the conflict haven't completely disappeared.
Right.
And they can resurface in times of political or economic instability.
And it seems like corruption, which was already a problem before the war, became even more deeply entrenched afterward.
That's right.
Okay.
The war created opportunities for profiteering and self-enrichment.
Right.
And this culture of impunity often shielded those who engaged in corrupt practices.
So it's almost like the war created this vicious cycle.
It did.
Conflict leads to corruption, which then undermines stability and development, which in turn can create conditions for further conflict.
Yes. It's a complex web of interconnected challenges.
Wow.
And it's a reminder that peace is not just the absence of war,
but
the presence of justice, equality, and opportunity for all.
So given all of this, what can other countries, especially those facing similar ethnic and political tensions, what can they learn from Nigeria's experience?
That's the question, isn't it?
It is a big one.
What lessons can we draw from this tragic chapter in history to prevent similar conflicts from erupting elsewhere? I think one crucial lesson is the importance of addressing grievances and inequalities before they escalate into violence.
So it's about being proactive rather than reactive.
Exactly. It's about creating inclusive political systems
where
all groups feel represented and have a stake in the country's future.
Okay.
It's about tackling corruption and ensuring that resources are distributed fairly.
And it's about fostering a culture of dialogue and reconciliation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Where people can talk about their differences openly and constructively.
What a powerful thought.
Yeah.
Diversity as a strength.
It is.
It seems like that's one of the key lessons that emerges from this deep dive into the Nigerian Civil War.
And it's a lesson that has implications far beyond Nigeria.
Right.
In a world increasingly divided by identity politics and competing interests.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that our shared humanity is what binds us together.
That's something for all of us to reflect on.
Yeah.
No matter where we live or what our background is. So as we wrap up this episode, what's the one question, the one big idea that you hope our listener will take away from this deep dive?
Given the enduring impact of the Nigerian Civil War and the lessons it offers, how can we as individuals and as a global community contribute to building a more peaceful, just, and inclusive world?
Wow, that's a big question.
It is.
But it's also an incredibly important one.
It is.
It's a call to action.
Yeah.
A challenge to each of us to reflect on our own roles in creating a better future.
And it's a reminder that the pursuit of peace is not a passive endeavor.
Right.
It requires constant effort, vigilance, and a willingness to confront difficult truths and challenge the status quo.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into a truly complex and impactful period of Nigerian history.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listener, thank you for being here. We hope this episode has sparked your curiosity and encouraged you to continue exploring the legacies of conflict and the enduring quest for peace